Welcome to West Film. We bring you the best movie recaps, reviews, ending explained videos, and hidden details from your favorite films. If you love great movies, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Now grab some popcorn, and let's jump into today's movie. Golden Leg turns around and spots a strange-looking garbage collector stretching nearby. Before he can react, the man launches himself into the air with unbelievable agility, leaving Golden Leg completely stunned. The stranger walks toward him with dramatic confidence, as if flames of passion are literally radiating off his body. An over-the-top display that hilariously ends up scorching Golden Leg's face. The eccentric man introduces himself as Sing, a devoted believer in Shaolin Kung Fu. He proudly hands over a suspicious-looking business card and launches into a passionate explanation of how Kung Fu can improve everyday life, pointing out random situations around them may helping people avoid accidents, making ordinary tasks easier. As proof, Golden Leg thinks the guy is completely insane, and to expose him as a fraud, he casually throws a beer can at him. In an instant, Sing kicks the can with such terrifying force that it disappears into the distance like a rocket. Golden Leg stares in disbelief but convinces himself it must have been some kind of trick. The two go their separate ways afterward, though Sing continues showing off his bizarre abilities all over the city. At one point, he casually helps someone move an entire refrigerator with ridiculous ease. Later, after collecting scraps and loose change from the garbage, he heads to a small restaurant hoping to buy some steamed buns. That's where he notices a woman named Mu. Sing is immediately mesmerized watching her cook using graceful Tai Chi-like movements. She flips dough through the air effortlessly and handles scorching hot cookware with her bare hands. To Sing, she looks almost magical. Unfortunately, he barely has enough money to buy anything. He awkwardly tries flirting with her, complimenting her beauty in hopes she'll take pity on him, but Mu refuses to give him food for free. Completely desperate, Sing leaves his disgusting, torn shoes behind as collateral, and honestly, those shoes look so horrifying that most people would probably pay money just to avoid touching them. Still refusing to give up, Sing suddenly starts singing loudly in the middle of the street in one last attempt to impress her. At first, everyone nearby stares at him like he's lost his mind, but somehow his weird energy becomes contagious, and one by one random people join his ridiculous singing and dancing until the entire street turns into chaotic musical madness. The performance comes crashing to a halt when the furious restaurant owner storms outside and orders everyone to leave. Taking advantage of the confusion, Sing grabs the buns and runs off without paying, accidentally leaving his awful shoes behind. Mu, clearly disgusted, immediately tosses them in the trash. Sing then goes looking for one of his former Shaolin brothers, a man nicknamed Iron Head, who now works at a nightclub. Excitedly, Sing explains his grand plan to revive Shaolin Kung Fu by mixing it with entertainment, singing, and dancing. But Iron Head has long since given up on those dreams. Tired, beaten down by life, and embarrassed by Sing's behavior, he tells him to stop chasing fantasies, especially when he can't even afford proper shoes. Before the conversation can go any further, the nightclub owner walks over and smashes a beer bottle over Iron Head's head, screaming at him to get back to work. Desperate to avoid further punishment and maybe impress his boss, Iron Head suggests letting Sing perform on stage as part of the entertainment. That decision turns into a disaster almost immediately. The boss forces both brothers onto the stage together, and their performance is painfully awful. The nightclub customers watch in shock as the two make fools of themselves, and eventually the crowd gets so angry that several of them storm the stage and start attacking. Sing clearly has the strength to fight back easily, but he refuses to fully retaliate because he doesn't want Iron Head to lose his job. Instead, he takes the beating and eventually gets knocked unconscious. Meanwhile, Golden Leg happens to be urinating in an alley when he notices something strange stuck deep inside a concrete wall nearby. To his amazement, it's the exact same beer can Sing kicked earlier. Realizing the kick might have actually been real, he tries pulling it free, and the wall instantly cracks apart from the pressure, leaving him shocked. At that exact moment, chaos erupts back at the nightclub as Sing confronts the violent customers. He calmly demands an apology for their disrespectful behavior, but they just laugh in his face before charging at him together. At first Sing tries to restrain himself, casually blocking their attacks while showing glimpses of his overwhelming strength, but the thugs refuse to stop. Finally, having had enough, he grabs a soccer ball and launches it directly at one of the gangsters. The impact sends the men flying backward like he'd been hit by a speeding truck. The thug somehow gets back up, pretending to be fine, only to suddenly vomit moments later from the internal damage. Sing then unleashes his full power, blasting the soccer ball again and again with terrifying force, smashing through concrete walls and sending gangsters flying across the nightclub one after another. The arrogant thugs are completely helpless against his soccer and kung fu onslaught, and terrified by the strength he's displaying, they immediately lose all their swagger and start begging him to stop. Even after defeating every thug in the nightclub, the victory doesn't make Sing happy. Deep down, he's still crushed that nobody takes Shaolin Kung Fu seriously anymore. Later, he sits alone on the street, sadly drinking a milkshake, lost in frustration. That's when Golden Leg approaches him again. Curious after witnessing the destruction at the nightclub, he asks if he can examine Sing's leg strength more closely, and Sing barely cares enough to object, letting him do it. The moment Golden Leg feels the raw power hidden in Sing's movements, his eyes light up as he instantly realizes Sing has the kind of ability that could completely transform soccer. Overwhelmed with excitement, Golden Leg proposes an idea that changes everything. Instead of trying to spread kung fu through random street performances, Sing should combine it with soccer. The sport could become the perfect stage to showcase Shaolin techniques to the entire world. Sing freezes in shock. For the first time, someone is treating his abilities as something truly valuable. Overwhelmed, he grabs Golden Leg and demands to be taught soccer right away. Golden Leg agrees, but first points out one important problem: a soccer player should at least have proper shoes. Sing instantly remembers the pair he left behind at Muir's restaurant and rushes back to retrieve them. When he asks for them, Muir casually tells him she threw them away because they were completely destroyed. That crushes him immediately, but just as he sadly turns to leave, she tosses the shoes toward him anyway. To his surprise, she secretly repaired them. And not only that, she decorated them with cute handmade stickers. Seeing the effort she put in fills Sing with happiness, and he smiles like a kid getting his first gift. Now fully motivated, Sing starts visiting his former Shaolin brothers one by one, asking them to join his soccer team and help revive Shaolin Kung Fu. Unfortunately, none of them seem interested anymore. Every brother has a different excuse, and most of them think Sing is still chasing impossible fantasies. After their master died, life became hard for all of them. Over time they abandoned their training and stopped believing their martial arts had any purpose in the real world, and their once legendary skills slowly faded away. One brother, once famous for incredible speed and agility, can now barely take a few steps without stumbling over himself. Although Sing leaves feeling defeated, his words unexpectedly awaken something in them. He reminds them of the passion and pride they once carried as Shaolin disciples, and that night he discovers all his brothers gathered dramatically on a rooftop, ready to train together again. The reunion feels epic for about 5 minutes. The actual training goes horribly. When Sing kicks the soccer ball for practice, he launches it so high into the sky that everyone has to sit around waiting nearly 2 hours for it to come back down. Golden Leg realizes Sing's problem isn't power, it's control. To teach him precision, He grabs an egg from the sixth brother and tosses it toward Sing, telling him to kick it carefully. Sing tries and instantly obliterates it on impact. The sixth brother watches in horror before charging forward to eat the remaining bits of broken egg off the ground, and the others have to physically drag him away while he cries dramatically over his ruined meal. Golden Leg tries again with another egg. This time Sing misses completely and it smashes against his pants instead. Panicking, he kicks yet another egg away at the last second, and it flies directly into the third brother's mouth, creating an extremely awkward accidental kiss that horrifies everyone watching. Despite the embarrassment, training continues, and Sing slowly starts improving, though another failed attempt sends yet another egg into the third brother's mouth, somehow creating an even worse repeat of the same awkward moment. The whole rooftop descends into chaos. Eventually, though, all the practice pays off. Sing develops incredible control over both his strength and technique, performing impossible soccer tricks with terrifying speed and precision, and his brothers watch in amazement as he manipulates the ball almost like it's alive. Confident enough to test the team publicly, Golden Leg enters them into their first official soccer competition. Their opponents look dangerous right away. Other rival players are infamous for using brutal violence during matches rather than actual skill, and, even worse, they turn out to be the exact same gangsters Sing humiliated at the nightclub. The moment their captain starts pulling hidden weapons out of his pants before the game even begins, you already know this match is going to become absolute madness. At first the game seems fairly normal, but judging purely by the Shaolin team's inexperience, they barely look capable of beating a group of schoolchildren, let alone professional thugs. Things escalate quickly once the opposing team abandons soccer entirely and starts openly attacking them. Just as Sing's team gets close to scoring, multiple players launch flying kicks directly at him, and chaos spreads across the field as the brothers get beaten down one after another. The stadium starts looking less like a soccer match and more like a full-scale street war. Watching his teammates get destroyed, Sing briefly considers running away. One of the brothers even waves his pants on a stick like a surrender flag, hoping the violence will stop, but the opposing team just laughs and cruelly demands he wear his underwear on his head to prove defeat. Humiliated beyond belief, he reluctantly obeys in front of the entire stadium. But that humiliation changes everything. Sing suddenly senses a shift in energy around his brothers and excitedly tells Golden Leg that their old spirit has finally returned. The shame and embarrassment have reignited the fire they lost years ago. In an instant, the Shaolin brothers awaken. The opposing players rush at them again. But now the balance of power has completely flipped. Each brother unleashes his unique abilities, effortlessly overwhelming the rivaled team and turning the match into total comedy. They toy with their opponents so badly the gangsters become living punchlines. At one point they try to distract the opposing goalkeeper, a guy who suspiciously looks like Bruce Lee, by throwing shoes at him from every direction. But he somehow catches every single one effortlessly before blasting the ball back towards Sing. Sing leaps into the air and delivers a massive flying kick toward the goal while the opposing team ducks in terror, convinced they're about to die. But after all that dramatic build-up, the ball smashes directly into the goal post. No score. Sing celebrates anyway, proudly welcoming his brothers back as true Shaolin disciples. Meanwhile, the defeated thugs suddenly abandon their hostility and awkwardly ask if they can join the Shaolin team too. Elsewhere, Hung continues preparing his own terrifying soccer squad. During one training session, he tests their abilities underwater with such extreme intensity that a massive explosion erupts inside the swimming pool. Not long after, Hung learns that Golden Leg has officially entered a new team in the competition, and curious, he personally visits the so-called Shaolin Soccer team to size them up. The moment he sees the group, he's not impressed in the slightest. He bursts out laughing, convinced they're a bunch of weird amateurs playing at being athletes. So confident they're harmless, he actually pays the tournament entry fee himself just to personally enjoy watching them get destroyed in front of the whole country. Naturally, he can't resist humiliating Golden Leg one more time, arrogantly ordering him to clean his shoes in public like a servant. But before Golden Leg can react, the entire Shaolin team starts fighting over who gets the honor of doing it instead. The argument escalates so badly that they end up carrying off Hung's shoe entirely, leaving everyone standing there in awkward confusion. Meanwhile, Sing returns to Muir's restaurant to properly thank her for repairing his shoes. Walking through town together, he notices beautiful dresses in a clothing store window and encourages her to try some on, genuinely believing she's prettier than she realizes and wanting her to stop hiding from the world. But Muir struggles badly with self-confidence, constantly worrying about her appearance, especially since flies always seem to buzz around her hair no matter where she goes. Sincere in his encouragement, Sing tells her that once he becomes famous by winning soccer matches, he'll buy her every beautiful dress she wants because she deserves to feel special. The scene sounds romantic until reality ruins it. It turns out Sing doesn't actually own the store. He only convinced the employees to let Muir try on the dresses by agreeing to mop the floors afterward. Not long after, the Shaolin team enters another tournament match, this time against a squad called the Tofu team, and the game turns into complete insanity almost instantly. The Shaolin players score so quickly that the opposing team thinks they're hallucinating, and no matter what the defenders try, they can't stop the attacks. At one point the Shaolin team kicks the ball so hard that opposing players get launched straight into the net along with it. The massacre becomes national news after the Shaolin team wins with an unbelievable score of 420-0. From that moment on, their popularity explodes. Match after match they dominate every opponent in their way, and crowds become obsessed with their impossible kung fu soccer techniques. The once forgotten Shaolin brothers suddenly become celebrities. Deeply touched by Sing's earlier compliments and hoping to become more beautiful in his eyes, Mu eventually visits a horrifying woman who performs cosmetic surgery. Honestly, judging by the appearance of the person running the place, trusting her with your face seems like the start of a horror movie rather than a makeover. After another major victory, the team gathers at Muir's restaurant to celebrate, but when she proudly reveals the results of her transformation, everyone is left speechless for all the wrong reasons. The makeover looks absolutely terrifying. Instead of reacting kindly, the team starts openly laughing at her, and naturally Muir becomes furious and embarrassed. At that exact moment the restaurant owner storms out to scream at her yet again, but this time she finally snaps. After enduring endless insults and abuse for years, she explodes with rage and unleashes all her frustration on him. The Shaolin team watches in shock, torn between cheering for her newfound confidence and being genuinely terrified of her anger. After calming down, Muir quietly asks Sing an important question. Does he like her? Sing honestly tells her he cares about her, but only as a friend and a sister figure. Trying to hide her heartbreak, she softly replies that if his shoes ever break again, she'll always be there to repair them. Without understanding the emotional weight behind her words, Sing casually responds that she doesn't need to worry, since he plans on wearing brand new shoes from now on, a response that completely crushes her. Honestly, it's hard not to feel for Muir here, because Sing is so unbelievably clueless about romance that he doesn't even realize he's just shattered her heart. Back on the field, the Shaolin team continues steamrolling every remaining opponent until they finally secure a spot in the championship finals. Their final challenge, Hung's terrifying Team Evil. Before the championship begins, Hung secretly meets with Golden Leg again and, just like years earlier, tries to bribe him into staying out of the game. He assumes Golden Leg can still be no bought if the price is high enough, but this time things are different. Golden Leg rejects the offer immediately. Hung, irritated, assumes his old rival is simply holding out for more money. Golden Leg calmly admits he's still greedy, just not for cash anymore. What he truly wants now is to defeat Hung's team and claim the national championship with his own hands. Meanwhile, before the finals start, Singh visits Muir's restaurant hoping to see her again, only to discover she's gone. Confused, he asks the owner where she went, and learns she was fired because all her steamed buns had recently turned strangely bitter and sour, driving customers away. Singh notices one fallen bun on the floor and takes a bite. The moment he tastes it, he freezes as the flavor makes him realize something heartbreaking. Muir must have been crying while making the buns all those weeks. Their earlier conversation clearly hurt her far more deeply than he ever understood. Soon after, the Shaolin team arrives at the massive stadium for the championship finals against Team Evil. Staring up at the national trophy, they smile confidently, knowing they're just one victory away from their dream. But first they have to survive Hung's monsters. The match begins with the Shaolin team attacking aggressively, and at first they cut through Team Evil surprisingly well, moving the ball effortlessly across the field. Eventually the ball reaches Singh, who unleashes one of his devastating kicks toward the goal, but to everyone's shock, the Team Evil goalkeeper blocks it effortlessly with one hand, the other casually resting in his pocket. He smirks and throws the ball back, challenging Singh to try harder. Singh tries a tricky follow-up shot, but the goalkeeper moves with terrifying speed and blocks that 1-2 without difficulty. Refusing to give up, Singh puts everything he has into a third shot, and this time the goalkeeper is finally forced to use both hands. Hung bursts out laughing from the sidelines and reveals the truth behind his team's monstrous abilities. Before the match, he secretly injected his players with performance-enhancing drugs that push their bodies beyond human limits. The Team Evil goalkeeper immediately retaliates by launching the ball across the entire field with unbelievable force, and the shot slams directly into the Shaolin goalkeeper, knocking him violently backward. Moments later, another devastating shot sends the Bruce Lee look-alike flying through the air. He somehow manages to stand back up, stubbornly pretending nothing happened, though it's obvious his left hand has been seriously damaged from blocking Team Evil's monstrous shots. Things only get worse from there. Another brutal kick smashes into him hard enough to send him collapsing to the ground, and before he can even recover, one of the Team Evil players kicks him square inches the face, launching him violently across the field like a ragdoll. That's when Hung finally reveals the horrifying truth behind his strategy. Winning the championship was never his primary goal. His real objective was to physically destroy every opposing player. He built a team designed to take out anyone standing in their way, and to guarantee success, he even bribed the referee to ignore every foul, no matter how violent things got. From that point on, Team Evil completely abandons any pretense of playing soccer, relentlessly targeting the Shaolin players with savage attacks and breaking the team down member by member. Bodies are thrown across the field, players are left injured everywhere, and the match turns into pure survival. Thankfully, before the violence escalates even further, halftime is called. Back on the sidelines, morale completely collapses. Several players become so terrified they outright quit the team on the spot rather than risk permanent injury. Singh burns with anger watching his brothers suffer, and tensions rise as the team argues with Golden Leg in frustration. The situation gets even more dangerous once they realize one more serious injury could get them disqualified entirely. Trying to restore order, the third brother steps forward and tells everyone to calm down. Knowing the goalkeeper position has become the deadliest role on the field, he volunteers to take it over despite the obvious risk. The second half begins, and the Shaolin team desperately tries to defend themselves with kung fu techniques, but against Team Evil's overwhelming strength they get knocked down again and again like bowling pins. The enemy focuses almost all their attacks on the new goalkeeper, firing devastating shots non-stop, each one pushing him closer and closer to the goal line. The friction from the impacts becomes so intense that his clothing literally starts tearing and burning away, and somehow he still refuses to fall. To everyone's shock, he finally manages to trap one of the incoming shots and immediately launches a counter-attack down the field. The Shaolin team charges forward together, creating their best offensive push yet, and eventually the ball reaches Singh, who drives a powerful shot directly at the Team Evil goalkeeper. For the first time all match, the goalie actually struggles as the ball ricochets wildly after impact, and he barely manages to knock it away after smashing violently into the goalpost himself. Realizing the Shaolin team still hasn't broken, Hung orders his players to unleash their ultimate attack. Team Evil combines their power into one terrifying kick and sends the ball hurtling toward a Shaolin goalkeeper with unbelievable force. He somehow manages to stop it, but the shockwave from the impact immediately knocks him unconscious, leaving the Shaolin team with too few active players. The referee prepares to disqualify them, and for a moment it truly feels like it's all over. Then, completely out of nowhere, Mia suddenly appears. She arrives with a bizarre new haircut that honestly makes her look less like a normal person and more like someone who wandered in from another planet. Ignoring everyone's confusion, she boldly volunteers to become the team's new goalkeeper. Singh immediately refuses as he knows how dangerous the match has become and doesn't want her getting hurt. But before stepping onto the field, Mia notices his shoes are falling apart again, and quietly hands him the old pair she repaired earlier, now decorated with even more stickers than before. As she walks dramatically toward the goal post, the emotional moment is instantly undercut when she accidentally smashes her head into something and then stands beside the opposing goalkeeper by mistake instead of her own. The entire Shaolin team hangs their heads in embarrassment while she awkwardly jogs back to the correct side of the field. Once play resumes, Mia attempts a simple pass to her teammates, but instead the ball rolls directly toward Team Evil, and everyone watching screams in panic. Seeing the perfect opportunity, the Team Evil forward charges up another terrifying shot aimed straight at her. But at the last possible second, she calmly uses Tai Chi techniques to redirect the force of the attack. Rather than fighting the energy head-on, she absorbs its momentum and controls it effortlessly. The entire stadium falls silent in shock as Mia begins moving the ball gracefully with incredible precision, making it seem almost weightless. Singh watches her in amazement, proud of her strength and confidence, and she smiles warmly back at him. Then the moment finally arrives. Mia gently launches the ball high into the air, and Singh explodes upward with everything he has left, channeling all his power into one final, legendary kick. The strike is so unbelievably powerful that it creates a massive tornado across the field. Team Evil is completely obliterated as their players blown apart in every direction, their formation destroyed instantly, and whatever dignity they had left disappearing along with them. Hung watches the disaster unfold in absolute fury, but in the middle of his meltdown, karma catches up to him. He slips and tumbles helplessly down the stadium stairs in front of everyone. Meanwhile, the Shaolin team erupts in celebration after winning the championship. In the middle of the chaos, Singh and Mia quietly look into each other's eyes, finally understanding each other without needing words. Not long after, Hung is arrested and eventually sent to prison once authorities uncover the illegal performance-enhancing drugs he used on his players. Sometime later, Singh can be seen jogging happily through the city streets, still wearing the same repaired shoes Mia gave him. Along the way, he notices the same woman from earlier in the story as the one who slipped and fell before. But this time things are different. Instead of crashing to the ground, she smoothly catches herself with a bit of kung fu style. Singh looks around and realizes more and more ordinary people are now using kung fu naturally in their daily lives. For the first time, he sees his dream fully realized. Shaolin Kung Fu has finally become part of the world again. When people talk about Shaolin Soccer now, there's a tendency to frame it as an instant classic that audiences immediately understood the moment it arrived. That really wasn't the case. The film genuinely confused a huge number of people when it first came out, and honestly, that reaction makes complete sense. Your first watch comes with a strange adjustment period, as your brain keeps trying to figure out what kind of movie it's decided to be. One moment it's playing like a traditional underdog sports drama, the next, someone launches through the air like they've crossed over from an anime universe. Before you can process that shift, the film pivots into slapstick comedy so exaggerated it almost feels like self-parody. Then, just when it seems to have hit its limit, it pushes even further into absurdity. A lot of viewers disconnected from that energy immediately, but the people who connected with it connected deeply. That's usually how cult films operate. They rarely try to politely win over every audience. Instead, they lock onto a very specific group of viewers and speak directly to them with total confidence. Shaolin Soccer has exactly that kind of personality. It's chaotic, oversized, emotionally sincere, wildly overconfident, intentionally childish, completely ridiculous, and strangely endearing because of all of it combined. I honestly think that's why the film survived through word of mouth for so many years. Back in the early internet forum era, this was one of those movies people brought up with almost aggressive enthusiasm, like they'd uncovered some hidden cinematic treasure. You'd constantly see people insisting you absolutely had to watch it, only for someone else to reply a few minutes later saying it was one of the most absurd things they'd ever seen. And honestly, that divide feels perfectly suited to this movie, because there's almost no neutral reaction to it. Even now, if you show Shaolin Soccer to a room full of friends, you can practically predict the outcome. Half the room laughing uncontrollably at the sheer absurdity of it all, the other half sitting there looking genuinely offended that cartoon physics have somehow invaded a soccer movie. What's interesting is that the film never tries to soften those reactions or ease audiences gently into its tone. That's one of the things I genuinely respect about it. It never pauses to explain itself, never carefully eases mainstream viewers into the weirdness. From the opening stretch, it's already operating on a completely uninhibited frequency where emotional sincerity and total nonsense somehow coexist in the exact same scene. After a while, that confidence becomes infectious. You start to realize the film isn't embarrassed by itself in the slightest. There's no cynical distance between the filmmakers and the material. No self-aware smugness trying to reassure the audience that everyone's in on the joke. The movie commits fully to every exaggerated kick, every impossible stunt, every melodramatic speech, every ridiculous visual effect, as though each is the most emotionally significant event in the world. And strangely enough, that level of commitment is exactly what makes it work. A lot of comedies age poorly because they feel desperate for approval. This movie feels like it genuinely doesn't care whether approval arrives or not. Its only objective is to entertain itself as enthusiastically as possible and hope the audience comes along for the ride. That's probably why fans defend it with so much passion. For a lot of people, this wasn't simply another sports comedy or martial arts parody. It felt genuinely original. Not polished in the traditional Hollywood sense, not carefully refined into something conventionally elegant, but original in that chaotic way where you watch it and think, I honestly cannot believe somebody combined these ingredients into this. And that originality matters, especially now, when so many mainstream comedies feel strangely calculated and algorithmically assembled. Watching Shaolin Soccer, it genuinely feels like a filmmaker throwing every outrageous idea imaginable onto the screen because he sincerely believes audiences might enjoy the ride. Some jokes don't land perfectly. Some sequences run longer than they probably should. Occasionally the film gets so excessive it almost collapses under the weight of its own insanity. But even people who dislike it usually remember it vividly afterward, and that matters. There are technically better films that vanish from your memory within days. Shaolin Soccer stays with you. Certain visuals, certain scenes, Certain moments of total absurdity permanently lodge themselves in your mind whether you invited them there or not. And honestly, I think that's why its reputation kept growing over time, not because audiences universally agreed it was perfect, but because nobody could confuse it with anything else. The premise itself sounds almost impossible to pitch with a straight face. It's the kind of concept somebody would invent after losing a bet. You're essentially telling a studio executive, it's about a washed-up soccer player who teams up with a man obsessed with Shaolin Kung Fu, and together they recruit his former martial arts brothers to form a soccer team with superhuman abilities. That already sounds absurd. But then the movie keeps escalating. Soccer balls ignite into flames, players launch through the air, goalkeepers survive impacts that seem medically impossible, and entire matches stop resembling sports altogether, feeling closer to supernatural warfare. And somehow, beneath all that chaos, the film still follows the emotional structure of a classic underdog sports story. That's the genuinely fascinating part. At its core, this is an extremely familiar formula. You've got the disgraced former athlete, the misunderstood outsiders nobody believes in, the intimidating rival team, the training montage, the tournament progression, the climactic final confrontation. Every ingredient audiences have seen countless times before. The difference is that Stephen Chow injects that formula with complete, unapologetic insanity. The film doesn't simply blend genres together, it crashes them directly into each other at full speed. One scene plays like a martial arts epic, the next becomes exaggerated slapstick comedy, then suddenly it turns into a sincere, inspirational sports drama for 30 seconds before somebody gets launched across the field like a human projectile. By all logic it should feel exhausting. Strangely, it mostly feels exhilarating. What I really admire is how committed the film is to that fusion. A lot of genre mashups stop at the novelty of the concept. They simply point at two incompatible genres and say, look, these things are together now. And that becomes the whole joke. But Shaolin Soccer actually builds its entire identity around the collision. The kung fu isn't decorative styling layered on top of soccer scenes. The movie genuinely treats martial arts as the ultimate evolution of soccer strategy. Every Shaolin ability becomes a sports mechanic. Strength transforms into devastating power shots. Acrobatics become impossible defensive saves. Speed, balance, and agility all translate directly into gameplay in the most absurd and entertaining way imaginable. And because the film treats its own ridiculousness with complete sincerity, eventually you start accepting it too. That's essentially if the movie constantly winked at the audience, the illusion would probably collapse. But everyone inside this world behaves as though Kung Fu Soccer is the most natural concept ever conceived, and eventually your brain simply stops resisting it. By the time the tournament sequences fully escalate, the movie barely resembles reality anymore. The matches feel closer to anime battles or arcade game boss fights than actual football. Team Evil doesn't even register as a normal sports opponent. They feel like the final antagonists in a fantasy epic. And honestly, that escalation becomes a huge part of the entertainment, because the film understands something incredibly important about sports movies: momentum matters more than realism. Every match needs to feel bigger than the last, more dangerous, more emotionally charged, more outrageous. So their movie keeps raising the stakes in the most excessive ways imaginable, and it does so with absolutely no restraint. There's also a surprisingly delicate tonal balancing act happening underneath all the absurdity that I think people often underestimate. Beneath the parody and exaggerated spectacle, the movie genuinely loves sports movie cliché copyright S. It absolutely satirizes them, but at the same time embraces them with complete sincerity. The motivational speeches are sincere. The comeback moments are sincere. The underdog triumphs are sincere. That's why the film never feels cynical. It's laughing with these genres far more than it's laughing at them. And honestly, that's probably the reason the whole experience stays charming instead of becoming exhausting. Beneath all the chaos, you can feel genuine affection driving the film forward. Stephen Chow clearly has a deep love for kung fu cinema, sports dramas, slapstick comedy, and exaggerated anime-style storytelling, all of it. The movie feels like someone gathering every creative influence they grew up admiring and throwing them together into one enormous, wildly unpredictable experiment. That approach absolutely creates messiness at times. The tone swings constantly between sincerity and absurdity. Entire stretches of story temporarily vanish while the film gets consumed by visual gags or oversized action sequences. Certain emotional moments get interrupted by comedy before they're allowed to fully settle. But honestly, I think that unpredictability is part of the appeal. You never quite know what kind of scene is coming next. A training montage suddenly turns into musical comedy. A serious confrontation erupts into exaggerated, cartoon-style impact. A soccer match escalates into something resembling a martial arts apocalypse. And somehow the film keeps holding itself together through sheer momentum and confidence. That's probably the single best word for Shaolin Soccer's energy: confidence. Even when parts of it don't fully work, the movie moves with such uninhibited enthusiasm that it's hard not to admire. It feels less like a carefully engineered screenplay and more like a filmmaker asking, what happens if we make the most excessive version of this idea imaginable? And somehow, against all conventional logic, that approach actually succeeds. What genuinely surprised me most about the film is that underneath all the exaggerated spectacle are the explosive soccer balls, the impossible martial arts techniques, the complete visual insanity. The structure itself is incredibly old-fashioned in the best possible way. Strip away the chaos and the foundation is almost comforting in its familiarity. The disgraced former athlete, the forgotten talents, the outsiders nobody respects, the corrupt tribal organization, the tournament progression, the climactic revenge match. It's essentially every classic underdog sports narrative ever made, simply filtered through total creative madness. And honestly, that familiarity is probably why the movie works as well as it does, and no matter how absurd the visuals get, the emotional structure underneath stays recognizable enough for audiences to remain connected. The story begins with Golden Leg Fung, and I actually think that choice matters more than people realize. Most viewers remember the outrageous soccer sequences first, but the film itself opens with failure and humiliation. Fung was once a respected soccer player until he was manipulated into throwing a match, and after missing a penalty kick, the public turns on him viciously. His leg is destroyed, his career vanishes, and decades later he's surviving as a broken-down nobody, while the man who betrayed him becomes wealthy and influential, running Team Evil. It's melodramatic, extremely melodramatic, but the film commits to that tragedy with such sincerity that it immediately gives the story emotional weight. Then Singh enters the narrative, feeling like he wandered in from an entirely different universe. He's optimistic, eccentric, almost painfully sincere, completely devoted to bringing Shaolin Kung Fu back into relevance even though nobody around him seems remotely interested. Once he crosses paths with Fung, the movie finally finds its emotional direction, because both characters are ultimately searching for different versions of the same thing. Fung wants redemption, Singh wants purpose. Soccer becomes the unlikely vehicle that gives both of them another chance to matter again. From there, the film essentially becomes the most gloriously unrestrained recruitment and training montage imaginable. One by one, Singh tracks down his former Shaolin brothers, and I genuinely love how the film introduces them. None of them are living legendary lives. They're exhausted, disconnected, trapped in repetitive routines, almost as if they abandoned essential parts of themselves years earlier. Then this completely outrageous idea suddenly forces them back together. That's where the underdog element truly starts to work, because even though these characters technically possess extraordinary martial arts abilities, the film still presents them as failures in the eyes of society. Nobody respects them, nobody believes in them, and half the time they barely believe in themselves. They're disorganized, awkward, emotionally disconnected, and far removed from whatever greatness they once had. Honestly, that's what makes them likable. The film understands something important about underdog stories. They aren't really about talent. They're about people rebuilding confidence after life has stripped it away from them. That's why even some of the film's most absurd moments still land emotionally. Underneath all the slapstick and spectacle, there's a consistent emotional thread about damaged people rebuilding themselves together. The tournament structure strengthens that feeling considerably. Every match pushes the team slightly further from being treated as a joke and slightly closer to being taken seriously. Early on, the soccer scenes feel almost experimental, as if the characters themselves are still discovering how kung fu can even function in the sport. Then, gradually, the film escalates into full-scale spectacle. By the time Team Evil emerges as the primary obstacle, the narrative starts feeling almost mythological. And yes, Team Evil is an incredibly unsubtle name, but subtlety was never really the objective here. They represent everything the Shaolin team rejects: say corruption, ego, artificial enhancement, greed, power without discipline. The film frames them less like a sports team and more like the final antagonists in a fantasy adventure. And because the movie already operates on its own exaggerated dream logic, that heightened approach fits naturally into their world it's built. What I appreciate is that the story never tries to overcomplicate itself to seem more prestigious than it actually is. A lot of modern sports dramas get so obsessed with emotional importance that they drown themselves in excessive subplots and endless speeches. Shaolin Soccer keeps its narrative surprisingly simple, maybe even too simple in places. Honestly, most of the emotional turns are extremely predictable. You can see many of the major story beats coming long before they arrive. But the movie understands that predictability isn't automatically a weakness. The entertainment comes from how those moments are delivered. A training sequence suddenly evolves into slapstick chaos. A comeback moment becomes an oversized supernatural action scene. Emotional setbacks are interrupted by visual absurdity. The film keeps reshaping familiar sports movie conventions into something stranger and more distinctive, and the sincerity is what keeps the underdog formula from feeling emotionally empty. The movie genuinely wants audiences to care about these people even with all the cartoon-like insanity happening around them. There's a surprisingly heartfelt emotional core holding the team together. Feng's bitterness, Sing's optimism, the brothers reconnecting with each other, Mui quietly becoming part of this strange, fractured little world. All of it gives the film more emotional warmth than many people probably expect going in. Does the pacing drag occasionally? Definitely. There are stretches where the movie gets so absorbed in exaggerated match sequences and visual comedy that the narrative momentum weakens slightly. Some of the emotional arcs could have used more development too, especially the romantic material. But honestly, I think the simplicity of the story becomes part of the film's identity. It almost plays like a fairy tale sports movie told by someone equally obsessed with kung fu cinema, cartoons, and classic underdog dramas. Everything is emotionally oversized, because that's how these stories feel when you're completely immersed in them. By the final match, the movie fully embraces that emotional exaggeration without hesitation. The stakes become enormous, the action becomes outrageous, the visuals become almost surreal, but the underdog spirit underneath it all stays surprisingly genuine from beginning to end. That's why the movie ultimately works beyond the novelty of its concept. Without that emotional foundation, Shaolin Soccer probably would have been little more than a collection of disconnected jokes and chaotic CGI spectacle, entertaining for a few moments but ultimately forgettable. Instead, because everything is built around redemption, teamwork, self-worth, and second chances, the insanity actually has emotional structure holding it together. Even at its most absurd, the film still wants that final victory to feel earned. And somehow, against all expectations, It actually does. One thing I genuinely didn't expect from Shaolin Soccer is just how emotionally sincere it becomes underneath all the absurdity, and I mean that in the best possible sense. On the surface, the film looks completely absurd: flaming soccer balls, gravity-defying martial arts, exaggerated cartoon-style impacts, characters reacting with oversized emotion every few minutes. None of that exactly suggests a deeply grounded emotional story. But somewhere along the way, almost unexpectedly, you start to realize the film is actually about a group of people who quietly stopped believing in themselves a long time ago. That's the part that stayed with me far more than I expected. Golden Leg Fung is probably the clearest example. When the movie introduces him, he's essentially living in the ruins of his former life. His career collapsed publicly, his body was permanently damaged, and the person who betrayed him went on to become wealthy and powerful while he faded into obscurity. The film exaggerates everything visually, sure, but emotionally that feeling is surprisingly authentic. You can sense someone who genuinely stopped believing his life still had meaning. Then Singh arrives with this completely unreasonable optimism, and honestly, the movie could very easily have made him unbearable. A weaker version of this character probably would have been. But there's something genuinely sincere about the way he believes in Shaolin philosophy and personal growth. He talks about Kung Fu as more than a combat technique. To him, it's discipline, self-respect, confidence, purpose. Essentially a way of reconnecting with identity itself. Most people around him treat those ideas as nonsense. But quietly, the movie proves him right. That's one of the things I genuinely appreciate about the film's approach to perseverance. It never frames growth through polished inspirational speeches or perfectly composed emotional monologues. These characters are awkward. They fail constantly. Half the team barely seems capable of functioning as adults when we first meet them. They're trapped in exhausting jobs, disconnected from each other, wasting abilities they no longer believe have value. And honestly, that's exactly what makes their eventual comeback satisfying, because the movie understands something a lot of underdog stories overlook. Losing confidence in yourself rarely happens all at once. It usually happens slowly. You quietly drift away from the version of yourself you once imagined becoming. That's essentially what happens to the Shaolin brothers. They didn't lose their abilities, they lost faith that those abilities still mattered. Soccer becomes the strange thing that gives them permission to care again. And yes, that sounds ridiculous considering this is a film where characters launch flaming footballs through the air like guided missiles, but emotionally that thread stays surprisingly grounded throughout the story. Every tournament victory feels less like we're becoming champions and more like we're remembering who we used to be. That creates a very different emotional atmosphere. The movie also repeatedly returns to the idea of forgotten traditions struggling to survive in a modern world that no longer respects them. Singh spends almost the entire film trying to convince people that Shaolin Kung Fu still has meaning. At first everyone dismisses him completely. His philosophy is treated like outdated fantasy. Then gradually those same old techniques become the foundation of something exciting, empowering, and culturally meaningful again. And honestly, I think that's part of why the film resonates emotionally even when the storytelling gets chaotic. Beneath the comedy and spectacle, there's a deeply human idea about rediscovering personal worth after feeling discarded by the world. You see it in Fung, you see it in the brothers, and you even see it in Mia's entire character is built around insecurity. She hides from people, emotionally and physically, and while the film occasionally plays that awkwardness for comedy, there's still a quiet sadness underneath it. Her connection with Singh works best whenever the movie stops forcing romantic structure onto them and simply lets them recognize each other as lonely people trying to feel valued again. Honestly, some of the film's sweetest moments are also its smallest, not the massive soccer explosions or the oversized martial arts sequences, just the brief scenes where these characters slowly start believing in themselves again. What really helps is that the movie never becomes fully cynical about any of it. A lot of modern comedies immediately undercut emotional sincerity with sarcasm, as if they're afraid of vulnerability. Shaolin Soccer absolutely makes jokes constantly, but it still lets emotional moments exist without completely mocking them. The film genuinely wants audiences to root for these people, and that sincerity carries it through its weaker stretches because, honestly, without emotional heart, all the exaggerated action eventually would have become exhausting. The oversized CGI spectacle works because there's an actual emotional engine underneath it. Every impossible kick, every dramatic comeback, every absurd victory matters because it's connected to characters reclaiming confidence, dignity, and purpose. Even Team Evil fits into that larger theme. They represent the opposite philosophy entirely: artificial power, corruption, ego, shortcuts, control without discipline. Meanwhile, Team Shaolin succeeds through rediscovered trust, perseverance, belief, and shared identity. The movie presents everything in broad, exaggerated strokes, but the emotional contrast is very clear, and strangely enough, despite all the chaos, the message never feels forced. It almost sneaks up on you. You go in expecting an outrageous martial arts sports comedy, and somewhere in the middle of all the insanity, the film quietly starts talking about failure, perseverance, self-worth, and second chances. Not in a heavy or overly dramatic way, more like a movie accidentally revealing it as genuine emotional depth while pretending to be completely unhinged. That's probably why audiences still love it. Not because it's subtle, and definitely not because it's polished in the conventional sense, but because buried underneath all the absurdity is a story about broken people slowly rebuilding their sense of worth together. And honestly, that emotional core feels surprisingly real. What truly gives Shaolin Soccer its personality isn't the soccer itself, or even the kung fu spectacle. It's the team dynamic. If these characters didn't work emotionally as a group, the entire film probably would have collapsed into disconnected CGI chaos after 20 minutes. The Shaolin brothers are really the heart of the movie, and what I appreciate is that the film doesn't introduce them as legendary warriors living noble, disciplined lives. It does the exact opposite. When Singh starts tracking them down, every one of them feels emotionally worn down by adulthood in a different way. One brother is trapped in exhausting labor, another barely seems motivated to function, another looks like life has slowly drained his energy over the years. Underneath the comedy, it's honestly a little sad. These men clearly used to believe there was something meaningful about themselves, and now they're just surviving day to day. That's why the reunion works so well. The film turns rebuilding the team into a strange mixture of slapstick comedy and emotional recovery. Early on, nobody really behaves like a team at all. They feel disconnected from one another, almost embarrassed by who they've become. Then, gradually, through all the absurd training sequences and exaggerated matches, they start reconnecting with that older, shared identity. The movie handles that progression in a surprisingly natural way, not through endless speeches or dramatic monologues, but mostly through momentum, through laughter, arguments, showing off, competing with each other again, rediscovering their chemistry. Slowly, the team starts to feel alive again. That progression matters enormously, because technically these characters are exaggerated caricatures. Each brother is built around one defining skill or personality trait. One specializes in headers, another in agility, another in overwhelming strength, another in impossible goalkeeping. On paper, they shouldn't feel emotionally real at all, but somehow the group dynamic gives them warmth, and you begin to believe in them as this dysfunctional little family. Early on, the martial arts abilities mostly function as visual comedy. The joke is essentially, look how absurd this soccer move has become. But as the film progresses, those abilities slowly start reflecting personality too. The way each brother plays begins revealing something about who they are, how they think, how they carry themselves emotionally. Even the disorganization between them helps say they're not polished heroes. Half the time they seem confused, emotionally immature, distracted by nonsense, or completely incapable of functioning with any real discipline. There's this chaotic sibling energy running through the entire team that makes them feel strangely believable despite all the cartoon physics and impossible action. You can sense the history between them immediately, and I really appreciate that the movie never tries to make them excessively cool. A lot of sports films eventually turn the underdog team into perfectly polished champions operating with total confidence. Shaolin Soccer keeps the brothers awkward. Even after they become nearly unstoppable, they still feel like a collection of eccentric misfits figuring things out in real time, and that awkwardness becomes part of the charm. There's also something genuinely satisfying about how the team slowly earns respect throughout the tournament. At first, everybody laughs at them. They look ridiculous, their style looks ridiculous, and even the concept of combining Shaolin Kung Fu with soccer sounds absurd within the world of the film itself. Then gradually opposing teams start realizing these people are actually dangerous, and because the audience watched the brothers start from such emotionally defeated places, those victories end up feeling surprisingly rewarding. The movie also understands something a lot of comedies overlook. Sometimes team chemistry is funnier than individual jokes. Some of my favorite moments aren't even the massive, effects-heavy soccer sequences. They're the smaller interactions between the brothers, the arguments, the showing off, the frustration, the random reactions during matches. The film spends enough casual time with them that the team eventually feels comfortable and lived in instead of merely functional to the plot. That becomes incredibly important later, because the movie grows extremely excessive as it moves toward the final act. Without the emotional grounding between the brothers, the climax probably would have collapsed into empty spectacle. But because the team dynamic feels genuine, the escalation still carries emotional momentum. You actually care whether these idiots succeed together. And interestingly, the film repeatedly circles back to the idea that teamwork matters more than individual talent. Singh is obviously extraordinary, but he can't carry everything alone. Funk can guide them emotionally, but he can no longer compete himself. Every brother contributes something different, and the team only truly works once they reconnect not only with Kung Fu but with each other. Honestly, that's the real emotional core of the film, not the tournament victories, not the revenge storyline, just a group of people who drifted apart gradually rediscovering shared purpose together. And the movie presents that emotional recovery with joy instead of heavy sentimentality. Even in its more emotional moments, there's still this playful energy underneath everything. The brothers communicate through chaos most of the time, and their bonding happens through absurd training exercises, exaggerated soccer destruction, ridiculous celebrations, essentially the loudest and most immature version of emotional healing imaginable. And somehow that makes it more endearing, because it doesn't feel artificially constructed. It feels messy, loud, chaotic, slightly immature, and very human because of it. Honestly, by the time the movie ended, that's the feeling I remembered most vividly, not necessarily who won every match or which visual effect looked wildest, but this strange little group slowly becoming a family again through the most ridiculous sport imaginable. That emotional chemistry is what keeps Shaolin Soccer from becoming just another random parody. Underneath all the exaggerated spectacle, it's really a story about connection, and somehow the film manages to sneak genuine sincerity into scenes where characters are literally launching flaming soccer balls through concrete walls. The characters themselves are honestly fascinating, because technically most of them are cartoons. Reduced to their basic components on paper, they're incredibly exaggerated. Nearly everyone is built around one dominant personality trait, one oversized gimmick, one extreme skill set. In a more grounded film these characters probably wouldn't work at all, but somehow the movie gives them just enough sincerity that audiences end up emotionally invested in them anyway. I think a huge part of that comes from Stephen Chow himself. Sing is such an unusual protagonist, not cool in the traditional martial arts hero sense. He's socially awkward, excessively enthusiastic, slightly clueless, constantly talking about Shaolin philosophy like he's trying to recruit random strangers into a self-improvement movement nobody asked to join. Half the time he comes across as a complete fool, then suddenly the movie reminds you he's also emotionally intelligent in ways almost nobody else around him is. That balance is exactly what makes him work, because beneath all the goofy behavior, Singh genuinely believes people are capable of becoming better versions of themselves, not in some artificial, motivational speech kind of way, but sincerely. He sees value in people that they themselves stopped recognizing years earlier. That's ultimately why the Shaolin brothers reunite in the first place. And honestly, Zhao performs the character with this incredibly strange energy that's difficult to fully describe, almost like childlike sincerity fused with complete chaos. One moment he's being ridiculous, the next he's delivering emotional scenes with such genuine conviction that the film somehow earns emotional honesty it probably shouldn't be able to sustain. A different actor could very easily have turned this character into pure irritation. Chow somehow makes him genuinely lovable. Then there's Golden Leg Fung, who honestly feels like the emotional backbone of the entire movie. Without him, the story probably drifts too far into pure absurdity. He grounds the film emotionally because his life genuinely feels destroyed when we first meet him. There's bitterness in him, and regret too. You can tell this is someone who's spent years replaying the worst moment of his life over and over in his head, the limp, the humiliation, the reality of working beneath the same man who betrayed him. The movie exaggerates everything stylistically, but Fung's emotional damage feels surprisingly grounded underneath it. And what I appreciate is that he doesn't instantly transform into an inspirational mentor figure. At first he's cynical, defeated, and honestly a little pathetic, not some wise coach patiently waiting for the perfect student to arrive, but a broken man slowly rediscovering purpose by coaching the most ridiculous team imaginable. That progression makes him far more interesting than the standard mentor archetype most sports movies settle for. The dynamic between Fung and Sing matters enormously too, because emotionally they're almost complete opposites. Sing believes in people too easily, Fung barely believes in anything anymore. One sees endless possibility, the other expects disappointment before anything even begins. Watching those two gradually pull each other toward emotional balance gives the movie far more depth than most people probably expect from a film about kung fu soccer. Then there's Mia, and honestly, she's probably the character I feel most conflicted about. Whenever the movie simply lets her exist naturally within the story, she's genuinely wonderful. There's something very sweet and awkward about her presence. The scenes of her making buns through Tai Chi-inspired movements are strangely charming, and she fits perfectly into the film's larger theme of hidden potential. She's another character who no longer sees herself as valuable until somebody else finally recognizes her worth. But the movie doesn't always seem entirely sure what to do with her. Sometimes she feels emotionally central to the story, other times it feels like the film forgets about her for extended stretches. The romance has moments I genuinely enjoy, because it's intentionally awkward and innocent, but emotionally the payoff never completely lands for me by the end. Still, she brings softness into a movie that could otherwise have been non-stop chaos. And honestly, the supporting brothers are a huge reason the film stays entertaining even during slower stretches. Again, they aren't deeply layered individually, they're built around exaggerated archetypes like Iron Head or Lightning Hand, oversized identities tied directly to their abilities. But the movie gives each of them just enough individuality that they start feeling distinct instead of blending together into one exaggerated group dynamic. and honestly their chemistry together matters far more than deep individual complexity. They argue like siblings, constantly try to outdo each other, lose focus, overreact emotionally. Half the time they feel less like disciplined martial arts masters and more like grown men who never fully matured past adolescence, which honestly makes them even funnier. I also really love the way Shaolin Soccer expresses personality visually through soccer itself. Every brother plays differently because every brother approaches life differently. One relies entirely on raw force, another survives through agility and instinct, another pushes forward through endurance. The matches become extensions of character rather than just oversized action spectacle. Even Team Evil reflects that contrast. Hung isn't remotely subtle as a villain, but honestly I kind of enjoy that about him. He represents corruption in the broadest, most exaggerated way possible: wealth, manipulation, ego, artificial enhancement, power without integrity. The movie essentially turns him into a physical embodiment of everything Team Shaolin is emotionally fighting against, and because the film already operates like a live-action myth most of the time, those broad characterizations fit naturally into its world. That's important to understand about these characters overall. They're not designed to feel hyper-realistic. Their emotional archetypes are filtered simultaneously through sports movies, kung fu cinema, slapstick comedy, cartoons, and parody. The real challenge was making them emotionally likable enough that audiences would stay invested underneath all the absurdity. And honestly the film mostly succeeds, not because the writing is incredibly subtle or psychologically layered, it isn't, but because the characters feel emotionally sincere. Even while the movie itself gets completely ridiculous, nobody behaves as though they're embarrassed to exist inside this world. The characters believe in their dreams with absolute conviction, even when those dreams involve turning kung fu into a weaponized soccer strategy. And somehow that commitment pulls the audience into the fantasy as well. That's why people still remember these characters years later, not because they're realistic, but because they feel strangely alive. The comedy in Shaolin Soccer is honestly almost impossible to explain properly until you actually experience it firsthand, because if you simply describe the jokes out loud, most of them sound unbelievably ridiculous. And I mean genuinely ridiculous. Someone gets launched across a field by a soccer ball. Characters scream in exaggerated slow motion. Musical sequences appear almost out of nowhere. People react to physically impossible events with mild inconvenience instead of shock. At one point the movie essentially treats soccer like an apocalyptic martial arts event capable of leveling environments and rewriting the laws of physics. That's the humor, and somehow it works far more often than it logically should. What I really appreciate is that the movie never relies on just one comedic style. It constantly bounces between different forms of humor almost recklessly. One moment it's operating through deadpan absurdity, then suddenly it shifts into chaotic slapstick, visual parody, awkward character comedy, or complete randomness, sometimes all within the exact same sequence. There's an incredibly unpredictable rhythm to the film that almost retrains your brain to stop expecting traditional punchlines. Sometimes the joke comes from how a character reacts. Sometimes it comes from how dramatically the camera treats something objectively idiotic. Other times the humor comes from the movie suddenly escalating an ordinary moment into total insanity for no reasonable explanation whatsoever. That escalation is honestly the foundation of the entire comedic style. The movie almost never settles for a single joke. It keeps pushing every sequence further and further until it transforms into complete spectacle. Somebody simply kicking a soccer ball isn't enough. The ball has to ignite, generate shockwaves, destroy half the surrounding environment, and send multiple players flying through the air like they'd been hit by military artillery. And the film commits to every single moment with complete conviction. That's what separates it from lazy parody movies for me. A lot of spoof comedies feel detached from their own humor, almost like they're standing outside the material pointing at how ridiculous everything is. Shaolin Soccer feels entirely immersed in its own madness. The characters genuinely take these moments seriously, which somehow makes them even funnier. The deadpan reactions especially land at times. Someone survives something physically impossible and everyone just accepts it within seconds. Or a scene suddenly shifts into complete nonsense without anybody questioning the logic of what's happening. The movie behaves as though its world already makes perfect sense, and eventually your brain simply stops trying to apply realism to anything. Honestly, the randomness shouldn't work as well as it does. There are moments where the comedy feels almost dreamlike, how the movie suddenly pauses on some bizarre visual gag or awkward interaction that technically has nothing to do with the story's momentum, yet the comedic energy somehow carries it forward anyway. You can absolutely feel the influence of older absurdist comedies in the structure. Certain sequences genuinely reminded me of Airplane or the Naked Gun films, where the density of jokes gets so relentless that even background details start functioning like punchlines. But the difference here is that Shaolin Soccer combines that absurdist energy with martial arts spectacle and sincere emotional storytelling at the same time, which honestly sounds disastrous described out loud, but the movie's confidence somehow drags you along with it. Now, does every joke land perfectly? Absolutely not. There are definitely stretches where the humor gets repetitive, and honestly that's probably the criticism I understand most. The film relies heavily on escalation and exaggerated reactions, so eventually some viewers adjust to the insanity instead of being surprised by it anymore. Once the audience fully understands the movie's comedic language, certain sequences lose a little impact, especially during parts of the later tournament matches. Early on, seeing Kung Fu integrated into soccer feels genuinely fresh and unpredictable, but later the movie has to work increasingly hard to top itself repeatedly. Sometimes it succeeds brilliantly, other times it simply gets louder instead of funnier. But even when individual jokes miss, I still found the overall comedic energy strangely infectious. The film feels like it's entertaining itself constantly, and honestly that matters more than perfect comedic precision sometimes. I'd much rather watch a messy comedy overflowing with personality than a technically polished one that feels emotionally lifeless. And Shaolin Soccer has personality pouring out of every frame. Even the weaker jokes feel fully committed. That commitment becomes part of the humor itself. The movie never pauses nervously after an absurd gag, waiting for approval. It simply keeps moving forward at full speed. If one joke doesn't work for you, another completely different style will probably arrive 15 seconds later anyway. And honestly, the visual comedy is where the film gets genuinely impressive at times. The CGI absolutely looks dated now, but the movie uses visual effects creatively instead of realistically. Characters stretch, spin, collide, launch across environments, and react with exaggerated cartoon logic that turns the entire movie into a form of live-action slapstick animation. The physics aren't merely unrealistic, they're intentionally comedic. The movie weaponizes exaggeration itself. Even relatively small emotional scenes often get interrupted by visual chaos. Someone tries to have a sincere conversation and suddenly complete madness erupts around them, and that tonal whiplash becomes part of the experience. Strangely enough, I think the movie's sincerity actually strengthens the comedy, because underneath all the ridiculousness the film genuinely cares about its characters and its underdog story. The humor isn't there to undermine emotion or mock vulnerability, it exists alongside it. That's why certain scenes can shift from heartfelt sincerity to complete absurdity within seconds without the film collapsing emotionally. Somehow Shaolin Soccer earns that chaos. The emotional foundation underneath everything is strong enough that the tonal swings feel intentionally playful instead of careless. I also really appreciate how completely unembarrassed the humor is. A lot of modern studio comedies feel strangely afraid of appearing genuinely silly. They immediately undercut every strange moment with self-aware dialogue or ironic detachment, almost reassuring the audience that nobody involved is taking anything too seriously. Shaolin Soccer has none of that anxiety. It's willing to look ridiculous constantly, and honestly I think that's exactly why audiences either completely embrace this movie or reject it outright. Its comedy demands participation. You almost have to surrender to the film's bizarre internal wavelength and accept that the next scene could contain absolutely anything. Emotional vulnerability, complete cartoon destruction, spiritual philosophy, slapstick chaos, oversized sports spectacle, all within the span of a few minutes. If you resist that energy, the movie probably becomes exhausting very quickly. But if you lock into its rhythm, it becomes one of the strangest and most entertaining comedies ever made. One of the reasons Shaolin Soccer feels so unique in the best possible way is that it constantly borrows from other genres and cinematic traditions without ever feeling like a lazy imitation of them. It's parody, but not the cheap kind built entirely around references and recognition. The film feels more like someone taking every cinematic influence they genuinely love, smashing them together recklessly, and somehow turning the resulting chaos into its own identity. You can feel martial arts cinema influencing nearly every frame, the exaggerated waifu movement, the gravity-defying kicks, the dramatic close-ups, the almost mystical energy surrounding combat. The movie is clearly playing with the visual language of classic kung fu films. Certain moments genuinely feel connected to something like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, where bodies move with dreamlike impossibility rather than physical realism. Except here, all that elegance gets redirected into soccer, which is already funny before the actual jokes even begin. The movie fully understands how absurd it is to apply legendary martial arts philosophy to football, and it extracts comedy from that contrast constantly. These characters approach soccer matches with the intensity of life or death combat, slow-motion confrontations, spiritual concentration, energy attacks disguised as kicks. It essentially operates on sports anime logic filtered through kung fu cinema. Then, layered on top of that, the movie constantly drifts into outright parody territory. Some sequences genuinely reminded me of Airplane or the Naked Gun films, because the humor frequently works through escalation and absurd interruption rather than traditional setup and punchline structure. A serious moment suddenly collapses into nonsense. A dramatic confrontation gets hijacked by visual chaos. Characters react to impossible situations with total sincerity. The movie weaponizes tonal whiplash, and honestly, what surprised me most is just how many different influences are moving around inside this thing simultaneously. One moment it feels like a traditional sports drama, then suddenly slapstick comedy, then parody, then anime spectacle, then melodrama, then full cartoon insanity all over again. At one point I genuinely thought it felt like a spaghetti western directed by people who'd consumed far too much caffeine while marathoning kung fu movies for days straight. Even the opening carries that exaggerated, mythic quality. But what keeps the movie from becoming a disconnected mess is that it never feels cynical about the genres it's playing with. That's the crucial difference. A lot of parody films eventually become smug, standing outside the material and simply mocking everything endlessly. Shaolin Soccer clearly loves the traditions it's drawing from. It exaggerates sports movie cliché copyright because it genuinely enjoys them. It exaggerates martial arts philosophy because it finds those ideas exciting and funny at the same time. The film laughs at these genres while also celebrating them, and honestly that balance is incredibly difficult to pull off. Because underneath all the absurdity, the emotional structure remains a completely sincere underdog sports story. The comeback moments are emotionally genuine. The training arcs matter emotionally. The rivalries matter emotionally. The movie is simultaneously parodying exaggerated cinematic storytelling while fully participating in it without hesitation. And strangely enough, that actually makes the parody stronger. You can tell Stephen Chow genuinely understands why these genres work emotionally instead of simply referencing them superficially. The action isn't random chaos. It's built around recognizable cinematic language, hero shots, tournament escalation, impossible final confrontations, emotional speeches before climactic moments, oversized rivalries. The movie simply pushes every one of those conventions far beyond reasonable limits, and honestly some of the funniest moments come directly from how seriously the film presents completely ridiculous material. Team Evil isn't subtle at all. Other villains practically feel imported from a comic book universe. The final match gradually stops resembling sports altogether and starts feeling closer to supernatural warfare. The players aren't merely talented athletes anymore. They function like oversized boss characters in a fantasy action game. Yet the movie frames all of it with complete sincerity, and that sincerity creates a really fascinating effect where parody and genuine emotional investment start blending together. You laugh at how outrageous the film becomes while simultaneously wanting the heroes to succeed anyway. And honestly, that's harder to pull off than it sounds. There's also a strong influence from exaggerated action cinema of that era, especially something like The Matrix. The slow motion, impossible movement, stylized impacts, dramatic physics. Except instead of using those techniques for sleek, futuristic coolness, Shaolin Soccer twists them into pure comedic excess. The film transforms cool into comedy through exaggeration. And honestly, that's probably why it still feels distinctive even after years of other genre mashups attempting similar combinations. Most hybrid films eventually lean too heavily toward one side. Either the parody overwhelms the emotional story, or the emotional story becomes too grounded for the absurdity to stay entertaining. This movie somehow exists directly in the middle of all those contradictions, too emotionally sincere to function as pure parody, too ridiculous to be taken completely seriously, too chaotic to fit neatly into a single genre, too heartfelt to feel cynical. And I honestly think that's why it remained memorable. Because even when you can clearly recognize the influences, martial arts epics, sports dramas, slapstick comedies, anime-style escalation, parody structure, the final result still feels strangely original. The movie absorbs all those inspirations and reshapes them into something louder, stranger, and far more emotionally genuine than you'd initially expect. Honestly, watching Shaolin Soccer sometimes feels like watching cinema itself get thrown into a blender. Sports movies, kung fu epics, cartoons, parodies, action blockbusters, old school slapstick, anime physics, and somehow the final result doesn't become meaningless noise. It becomes its own bizarre little universe. The visual style is honestly another huge reason the film feels so unforgettable, because your reaction to it probably falls somewhere between "this is incredibly creative" and "this is completely insane." Possibly both at once. The CGI in Shaolin Soccer isn't trying to fool you for even a second. The effects are exaggerated, cartoonish, intentionally ridiculous looking at times, and the movie absolutely knows it. This isn't a film desperately trying to convince audiences its effects are realistic. Soccer balls erupt into flames. Players bend physics like reality is optional. Bodies stretch through the air like animated characters. Entire stadium sequences stop resembling sports and start looking closer to supernatural catastrophes. And honestly, I think the film gets smarter by embracing that artificiality instead of fighting it. If Shaolin Soccer had tried to make all this feel grounded and realistic, it probably would have aged terribly. Instead, it fully embraces this exaggerated comic book aesthetic where realism stops mattering almost immediately. The movie basically looks at the audience and says, Yes, this is absurd anyway. Here's a flaming bicycle kick powerful enough to level half the environment around it. And somehow that confidence makes the visuals strangely endearing instead of overwhelming. You can really feel the anime influence running through the movie too, not just in the action itself, but in the visual rhythm of everything. Characters pause dramatically before attacks. The camera aggressively pushes inward during emotional moments. Power is expressed emotionally rather than physically. Every soccer technique feels less like athletic skill and more like somebody unleashing an ultimate special move from an arcade fighting game. The final matches especially stop functioning like sports entirely at a certain point. Shaolin Soccer fully transforms into live-action cartoon warfare. Players launch across the field, shockwaves tear through the air, goalkeepers survive impacts that should realistically register as controlled detonations. The escalation becomes completely detached from reality, but because the movie establishes that visual language so early and commits to it so fully, your brain eventually just accepts it. And honestly, that's one of the film's biggest visual strengths, a consistency through inconsistency. Nothing obeys real-world physics, but the movie follows its own internal visual logic with such confidence that it creates a genuinely immersive effect. Eventually you stop asking whether something looks realistic and start asking whether it feels entertaining. And most of the time it absolutely does. I also really love how energetic the camera work is throughout the film. It almost never sits back passively observing the action. The camera swoops, spins, rushes forward, pulls back dramatically. Sometimes it genuinely feels like the camera itself is participating in the chaos on screen. There are moments where scenes begin normally and then suddenly erupt visually. A close-up expands into an oversized reveal. A simple interaction escalates into full spectacle. Even the transitions occasionally feel playful instead of merely functional. That movement matters because the entire personality of the film depends on momentum. The visuals are constantly trying to surprise you. And yes, obviously some of the CGI looks dated now. There's really no point pretending otherwise. Certain effects absolutely reflect early 2000s digital experimentation. And some shots look gloriously artificial. But honestly, I think that artificiality becomes part of the appeal. The movie often feels less like traditional live-action filmmaking and more like somebody dragged comic book panels or anime frames directly into physical reality. That's exactly why the exaggerated visuals support the comedy instead of undermining it. When somebody kicks a soccer ball so hard it ignites into flames, realism would actually weaken the joke. The absurdity is the entire point. The exaggerated visual effects almost become punchlines in themselves. The film turns excess into comedy and keeps escalating that excess constantly. Every match has to feel bigger than the last, more explosive, more impossible, more outrageous. The movie understands that once audiences fully accept the concept of Kung Fu Soccer, the only remaining option is to keep pushing the visual insanity further and further. What's funny is that despite all the chaos, there's still a surprising amount of creativity in how the action gets staged. Every player's abilities get expressed visually in different ways. One brother moves with acrobatic elegance, another hits with the force of a wrecking ball, another turns goalkeeping into something almost supernatural. The visuals aren't random noise, they're character-driven exaggerations. Even Team Evil carries this oversized comic book villain energy visually. The film frames them like monsters, and their presence changes the atmosphere of the matches entirely, making the action darker, heavier, more destructive. By the final act, the movie essentially looks like a sports apocalypse directed by someone raised on kung fu cinema and arcade games. And honestly, there's something refreshing about how completely unrestrained all of it feels. Modern blockbusters spend enormous amounts of money trying to make CGI invisible. Shaolin Soccer almost does the opposite. It wants you to notice the exaggeration, wants the visuals to feel heightened, impossible, oversized, and slightly ridiculous. That gives the movie personality. You may not think every effect looks flawless, but you absolutely remember them. The film almost never feels visually static as the camera is constantly drifting, pushing forward, circling characters, revealing new information mid-shot. Even relatively simple conversations carry this restless visual energy, almost as if the film physically cannot sit still for very long. And honestly, that hyperactive style fits the movie perfectly, because the entire experience runs on momentum. Some criticize the humor as childish or random, and honestly, none of those criticisms are entirely wrong. What makes The Divide fascinating is that fans of the movie often describe those exact same qualities as strengths instead of weaknesses. That's what makes the audience split so interesting. One person sees chaotic pacing, another sees energetic unpredictability, one person sees cartoonish visual effects, another sees imaginative visual creativity, one person sees ridiculous slapstick, another sees fearless absurdist comedy, one person sees tonal inconsistency, another sees emotional spontaneity. The movie basically depends on whether you interpret its success as irritating or liberating. And honestly, I think cultural expectations probably play a role too. A lot of viewers go into Shaolin Soccer expecting either a traditional sports comedy or a traditional martial arts movie, but the film isn't interested in behaving conventionally like either one. It operates on this bizarre, exaggerated emotional logic where realism barely matters at all. That disconnect immediately throws some viewers off, especially people who prefer restrained comedy or grounded storytelling. If your ideal humor style is dry realism, carefully controlled satire, or understated dialogue, this movie probably feels like being repeatedly hit in the face with a cartoon hammer. And honestly, the movie would probably take that as a compliment, because restraint is the absolute last thing Shaolin Soccer wants associated with its identity. I also think part of the critical divide comes from just how emotionally sincere the film actually is. Some audiences love that sincerity because it gives all the absurdity genuine emotional weight. Others feel the heartfelt moments clash awkwardly with the cartoon comedy. Honestly, both reactions make complete sense as the film swings wildly between goofy slapstick and genuine warmth, sometimes within the exact same scene. If you're emotionally aligned with the movie, that combination feels charming. If you're not, the tonal shifts can feel chaotic or emotionally confused. And honestly, I think the movie's reputation improved over time, partly because audiences gradually became much more comfortable with exaggerated genre mashups. When Shaolin Soccer first spread internationally, it genuinely felt strange to a lot of viewers. Now audiences are far more accustomed to stylized action, anime-inspired storytelling, hyperactive comedy, and emotionally heightened spectacle. So modern viewers often approach the movie with fewer expectations about what it's supposed to be. That openness helps enormously. Still, even today, Shaolin Soccer remains the kind of movie people argue about passionately. And honestly, I think that's healthier than becoming universally fine, because movies everyone politely agrees are decent usually disappear culturally. This movie didn't disappear. People still quote it, recommend it, debate it, compare versions of it, argue about the pacing, argue about the humor, argue about whether it's genius or complete nonsense. That means the movie made people feel something, and honestly I'll always respect that more than technical perfection. Even viewers who completely dislike it usually remember it vividly afterward. They remember the flaming soccer balls, the completely unhinged final match, the bizarre comedic rhythms, the exaggerated performances, the movie's total refusal to behave like a normal film. It leaves an impression, and honestly that's incredibly difficult to pull off, especially in comedy, which often ages terribly or fades from memory once the jokes stop feeling surprising. But Shaolin Soccer survives because its identity is so aggressive and specific. Nobody else really combined this exact mixture of emotional sincerity, sports drama, martial arts spectacle, slapstick absurdity, anime logic, and visual chaos in quite the same way. So yes, I completely understand why the movie divides people. Honestly, I think it was always supposed to. A film this strange was never going to be universally embraced. But the fact that audiences still react to it passionately years later probably says far more about its success than any perfectly balanced critical consensus ever could. The older Shaolin Soccer gets, the more I appreciate how unlikely its success actually was. Because this movie really shouldn't have worked this well long term. A live-action comedy about kung fu-powered soccer players sounds exactly like the kind of concept people laugh about for a weekend before completely forgetting once the novelty fades. You'd expect it to become a weird early 2000s footnote, a goofy cult curiosity people mention occasionally before moving on. But somehow the movie stayed alive. And honestly, I think that happened because Shaolin Soccer possesses something many technically better movies never achieve: an instantly recognizable personality. You can show somebody a random 10-second clip from this film and they'll immediately know what movie it is. The exaggerated physics, the explosive visual energy, the screaming reactions, the emotional sincerity buried underneath complete nonsense. It all feels unmistakably specific. And identity matters enormously, especially in comedy, because comedy ages horribly when it depends too heavily on trends or references tied to one specific cultural moment. But Shaolin Soccer never really cared about fitting neatly into any particular era's definition of cool. It built its own strange universe instead, and that weirdness became timeless in its own way. The movie also helped prove that genre mashups didn't need to play it safe to resonate globally. Before this, a concept like martial arts sports comedy with anime physics and slapstick parody probably sounded commercially disastrous to many studios. Then the movie arrived, and audiences everywhere connected with it anyway, not because it had been polished into mainstream safety, but because it committed completely to its insanity. That commitment became part of its legacy. You can honestly feel traces of Shaolin Soccer in many later action comedies and stylized genre films that became more comfortable embracing exaggerated visual storytelling without apologizing for it. Especially movies willing to combine emotional sincerity with complete absurdity instead of separating the two. The film normalized emotional chaos. And honestly, I think it also helped international audiences become more open to different comedic rhythms. The humor here doesn't always function like traditional Western comedy structure. Jokes stretch awkwardly, reactions escalate unpredictably, emotional scenes suddenly collapse into slapstick disasters, the pacing intentionally drifts into weirdness sometimes. And yet audiences still connected with it. That matters, because it proved comedy doesn't always need to translate perfectly line for line if the emotional energy and visual intent are strong enough. Stephen Chow communicates through movement, rhythm, exaggeration, sincerity, and pure enthusiasm as much as through dialogue, and that style of filmmaking travels surprisingly well. And honestly, I think the movie's emotional optimism is one of the biggest reasons it remained lovable instead of becoming cynical nostalgia. The film genuinely likes people, even the losers. Honestly, especially the losers. There's warmth underneath all the absurdity. The underdog story isn't ironic. The friendship isn't ironic. The emotional redemption isn't ironic. The movie believes completely in second chances and self-worth, even while turning soccer matches into supernatural disasters. And that emotional honesty gives the film real staying power. Because once the novelty fades, audiences still have something human to connect with underneath all the spectacle. And honestly, the imperfections became part of the legacy too. The messy pacing, the overextended jokes, the ridiculous CGI, the tonal chaos. People don't remember Shaolin Soccer as some perfectly engineered comedy masterpiece. They remember it as this wild, lovable explosion of creativity that somehow held itself together through pure enthusiasm. It feels handmade, and honestly that matters more and more now, especially in an era where so many massive studio productions feel algorithmically polished into emotional emptiness. Shaolin Soccer feels like a filmmaker throwing every strange idea he genuinely loves directly onto the screen without obsessing over whether all of it fits together perfectly, and audiences respond to that kind of creative freedom, even when it gets messy. And honestly, the movie's legacy also survives through Kung Fu Hustle, because culturally it's almost impossible to separate the two anymore. Shaolin Soccer opened the creative door first. It demonstrated how Chow's blend of slapstick absurdity, emotional sincerity, visual chaos, martial arts spectacle, and comic book logic could resonate internationally. Without this movie, I honestly don't think Kung Fu Hustle lands the same way globally. This was the breakthrough, the proof of concept, the moment audiences realized Stephen Chow wasn't simply making strange comedies, he was creating his own cinematic language. And honestly, I think one of the biggest compliments you can give Shaolin Soccer is that nobody has truly replicated its exact feeling since. People copied the surface-level ingredients, over-the-top action, sports parody, CGI exaggeration, anime-style movement, but very few films captured the same emotional balance between absurdity and genuine warmth. That's the part that's hardest to imitate, because the movie isn't just random chaos. It's hopeful chaos. And honestly, years later, that optimism still feels strangely refreshing, especially because Shaolin Soccer never tries to pretend cynicism is automatically more intelligent than joy. The movie embraces joy completely, loudly, recklessly, occasionally stupidly, but completely, and that sincerity is a huge part of why the film endured. Because underneath all the exaggerated action, slapstick absurdity, and visual madness, there's something genuinely uplifting about watching a movie so completely unafraid to be enthusiastic. Modern blockbusters often feel terrified of looking uncool. They hide behind irony, self-awareness, emotional distance, softening every heartfelt moment with sarcasm so audiences never feel too exposed. Shaolin Soccer does the opposite. It wants audiences cheering, laughing loudly, believing in impossible comebacks, feeling emotionally invested in something completely ridiculous. And honestly, I think there's something kind of brave about that, because emotional sincerity is risky, especially in comedy. Once a movie openly commits to heartfelt optimism, audiences either connect with it deeply or reject it instantly. There's no safe middle ground anymore. But Stephen Chow commits anyway, completely. And that's why the movie's emotional energy still feels surprisingly alive decades later. Not because the CGI aged perfectly, not because every joke still lands, not because the pacing suddenly became flawless over time, but because the enthusiasm feels genuine. The film genuinely wants audiences to have fun, not in a calculated, studio-tested way, but in a loud, messy, almost childlike way. And honestly, I think audiences can feel the difference. That's part of why the movie remained culturally memorable while so many technically cleaner comedies faded away completely, because Shaolin Soccer doesn't feel manufactured to satisfy trends. It feels like a filmmaker throwing every influence, emotion, joke, visual idea, and piece of creative excitement directly onto the screen simply because he loves movies.